favorite art forms.
Sequential art form
is a form of entertainment.
It's one of the hardest art forms to both master and I think sell and actually get an audience for.
To me, it tells a story. So to me, it's a storybook, and as a sequential arts major, it's also my future livelihood. I mean, I'd rather read a comic book than watch TV. It's like a byproduct of the person who made it soul. I mean, they put themselves into the book. You can tell how much they put into it. It tells you as much about the artist as it does about the storyline.
They're basically how I express myself. Mainly I do manga style, but I've dabbled in comics, and it's basically my childhood.
Comic books are also extremely heavy in production. You have 24 pages. They have to be inked, lettered, colored if you are rich enough to print in color. I love comic books. It's a great medium. If there was any egg that I was going to try and crack, it would be that.
Evolutions of fairy tales and myths, in all senses of a definition, it is sequential art. It is telling a story with pictures and words. And so as far as that goes, for me, there are no limitations to what a comic book can be. Now, I grew up reading Batman and Daredevil and things like that, so for me it's often kind of locked in the realms of fantastic, supernatural, in terms of a genre or science fiction, but it doesn't have to be constrained to that.
In terms of people, I'd have to say Matthew Shockley, who was my art teacher in high school, really pushed me towards my comic books, and he gave me a good idea of how to do the dark and gritty sort of stuff. Similarly, his coworker and friend Jason Shipp also inspired me with one of his comics. And there's also Sean Allen, who I would love to be just like when I get older. He's flipping awesome. But most of my inspiration comes from the shows and stuff that I used to watch as a kid. Martial arts movies, first and foremost. I love a good martial arts movie. And, I mean, there's Dragon Ball Z is a slight influence, but let's face it, not everybody's going to scream for 30 chapters and then win the fight in 5 minutes. And definitely Shaman King and Flame of Recca. Actually, I've got a lot of influence from a lot of different sources, both American and Japanese comics. If anything, I have to say my inspiration comes from those anime and some of the books I've read, like the Aragon series, or in some senses Harry Potter, here and there.
I'm more inspired by, like I said, Eastern style manga. I've read a lot of Dragon Ball Z, Naruto, One Piece. That's basically what I do most. I really want to get my art out there, and I want other people to be able to get their art out there through me. I want to be able to own my own studio and have other people become famous through me.
An artist that I've always looked at is Frank Miller. I love Frank Miller's artwork. It's stark, it's dynamic, it's gritty. I've read Frank Miller since I was a kid, starting with Daredevil and his early works on Daredevil, and followed him through his career. So he's one of my main artists that I like to read, but there's lots of great artists. Stuart Immone's a guy that I've been kind of keeping track of recently, and there's lots of really good artists.
Its main purpose is to tell a story, and it's used as escapism. How other people use drugs or alcohol or video games. That's what comic books are there for also. You can pretend that you're the hero. Instead of reading about Batman, I am Batman. And so I take in his journeys to picture myself in that position.
Okay, it allows me to escape the real world and allows me to, envision and probably feel you know, like the fictional world I'm reading. Like if I'm reading Batman, I feel like I'm in Gotham City, just, you know, viewing everything. If I'm reading Spider-Man, I'm in New York City. Reading anything else, I feel like I'm in that universe, but I'm not.
I mean, I was gonna say it in like a simpler form. Like when you read like a certain book, it gives you that sense of imagery, so that when you're reading, you have that whole scenery in your head. Now with comic books, it already gives you that scenery. You see the plot unfold by yourself, and you just see how even though certain pictures it just has like one pose, you can feel like you like act out the whole thing just alone in your head just by that one picture. So it gives you like I don't know, it gives you like a sense of scenery and everything. Makes you feel like you're there.
I just really like the stories. Doesn't really make me feel any particular way. I guess it would just depend on the title. Some titles kind of make me feel like a kid again, like Venom or Spider-Man, because that's what I read when I was really young. But they're just fun. I don't know. It just makes me kind of get away.
They're just another way to express epic stories, or they can be comedic. And it's really cool because comic books can be about all sorts of things, and you could see that more and more as comic books existed. Like from the 70s on, they started to have all kinds of different stories.
I wish they would make more comics, not so as like relevant to like today's topics, because I really don't want to hear, you know, watch or even read a comic book that's talking about something that happened last year in like the real world or some type of, no, I don't want to read that. The whole point of me reading a comic is to actually like look at something like fantasy wise. I don't want to see real world stuff in a comic book. I can read a newspaper for that. So I'd rather just, you know, keep the mind thinking. Because the more you bring in like relevant stuff like nowadays, that takes away the whole imagination of everything.
Yeah, that's a good word.
That's because, as I said before, like when you read a comic book, you're seeing like a whole storyline in your head go off. When you're reading relevant stuff, you already know what happened. So like, no, I don't want to see real people doing real things in a comic. No, I want to see some dude flying off and saving somebody, picking up a building and throwing it at someone.
Yeah.
I don't want to read somebody got shot in a bullet and now he's just dead in the next scene. No. Keep it fancy.
So I don't want to read a comic book that says, oh, the stock market is prominent. Oh, the war is getting worse. You know, I want my imagination to be caught. Like, I want to see somebody unnaturally powered by, like the Fantastic Four. I want to see somebody that have a lab accident, and then I just want to see a guy.
Next thing you know, they're a mutant.
Yeah, I want to see.
Our imagination going.
I want to see out of the ordinary. I want to see stuff that can't happen in the real world. That's virtually impossible.
Exactly.
That's what I want to see.
Take my imagination and run with it.
Yes.
Don't give me something I watch on CNN.
Yeah.
Well, I've been drawing comics for the majority of my life. Started back when I was a small child, got heavy into like Dragon Ball Z and more Western comics like Superman, Batman, and all that, and I just stuck with it. Like, it was what I knew. My art style is more manga, so I don't usually do like realistic proportions. I mean, the proportions are good, but the details aren't usually realistic. They're more simplified, and I use heavy line. I put a lot of emphasis on like a lot of times crazy hairstyles.
I think when I was about 7 years old, I decided I wanted to start drawing comics because this is what I was reading at the time. My brother was like 4, and he decided he would try and do that with me. It'd be a good idea. So I'm to blame for him, you know, wasting his life. But my art style, I kind of, it's gritty. It's kind of dark. We don't produce children's comics. I have a small company with my brothers called PLB Comics, and it's mostly kind of dark, vigilante, violent style stuff. They're black and white, so we use a lot of harsh light and kind of that Frank Miller Sin City style stuff. We do a lot of that.
Let's see. I would say the first time I started reading comic books was around the age of 12. Back when Borders Bookstore wasn't bankrupt. I went in there one day and I happened to see the entire history of Spider-Man in one book. And I was interested because I always heard of Spider-Man, but I never read it. So I picked it up and I started reading from the Amazing Comics. And I never stopped reading Spider-Man. I still read it. I wish I had one with me, actually.
The first time I really started reading comics was when I watched the TV show Berserk, and it ended. But then I later found out that they continued on in the manga and the comic books. And so I wanted to keep on learning more. I wanted to learn more about Guts, and I wanted to learn more about Griffith and everybody else. And it's still ongoing, and I'm still reading it now, and it's great. And I've been keeping up with that, and I've been a fan ever since.
The first time I started reading comics, I was about 12 years old. And I stopped for quite a few years for monetary reasons, but now I'm back into it pretty heavily. Spider-Man and Venom, I mean, it was, I pretty much bought like a handful of both of them. And then my dad, of course, bought me when Superman died, he got me that one. A few ones after that, but I never really liked Superman. So.
I started picking up when I was a kid. I lived on the Eastern Shore, and locally speaking, there weren't comic stores and things like that. And so when I was a child, you picked up comics at like gas stations, convenience stores, the grocery store. And so I started reading comics when I was real young, and it just fascinated me. And I would try to, I would copy images from the comic books and cartoon strips, and then I started making my own characters and own drawings, and so it kind of evolved. As an artist, I kind of have to pinpoint comics and cartooning as a source of my inspiration, even though it's taken me in lots of different ways. My initial source of inspiration were comics and comic books.